Well, it is great to see everyone this morning. It's a beautiful day out there and getting nicer. So a while back, a meme rotated around the internet, as they do, that had the words, "Money won't solve your problems." And then the response was, "Brah, please, I've got 100 problems and more money literally solves 99 of them." Someone else on the internet made this statement. No offense, but money would solve literally every single one of my problems. Like all of them. I don't have a single problem that money wouldn't immediately solve. And this is a really, really common idea in the world. That money answers all the problems. People think, well, if you've got housing problems, well, money's going to solve it. If you've got car problems, money's going to solve it. If you've got marriage problems, they think money's going to solve it. If you're lonely, well, money. If you don't have enough friends, well, money. If you're bored, well, money. And they think that money is the answer to everything. In fact, this idea has infiltrated our psyches so much that I've talked to people who call themselves Christians who blame their spiritual problems on a lack of money. And their thinking goes like this. They say, well, I would love to study my Bible more and pray more and to come to more Bible studies and worship services. I'd love to do that, but I can't because I have to work more hours. And I have to work more hours because I need the money for health problems, housing problems, car problems, relationship problems, whatever. And they think money would solve even their spiritual problems. The thing about it, though, is that money only solves money problems. And on top of that, everybody in every life situation thinks they could use more money. Poor people, well, they could use a little bit more money to make ends meet. Middle-class people, well, they could use a middle to large amount of money to solve their problems. And people that are millionaires, well, they could just use a couple more million. No matter where you're at in the monetary spectrum, people think they could always use just a little bit more. You don't very often hear a millionaire going on and doing a interview about how they've got plenty of money, they don't need to earn any more. You know, they don't need to get any more interest or any more businesses started, do you? You always hear about them saying, well, they need more. So, if money only answers money problems, but yet we as individuals still hold money up as the solution, then where's the problem really lie? Well, today, as we are continuing our sermon series about siding with the winner, today we're going to be asking the question, are you a double agent for money? And I love the imagery here. You know, those old spy movies where someone says they're working for this government, but they're actually working for that government, and they're sending secrets back to the other government. They're a double agent. Well, sometimes that's the way we are about money. We say we serve God. We say that we are devoted Christians. But we end up spending all of our time working for money instead of working for God. So to have this conversation today, to study this out, we're first going to see the fact that you cannot serve two masters. We're then going to discuss some of the evils that come about by the love of money. And then finally, we're going to discuss the solution. And the solution is contentment. Now, this is not a sermon on how to manage your money. There are lots of resources in the Brotherhood about managing money. But this is a sermon about our hearts and where exactly we put our faith. So, let's jump in and let's discuss the fact that you cannot serve two masters. Let's go to Matthew 6, which Silas read for us a few minutes ago. Matthew 6, starting in verse 19. And Jesus says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroy and where thieves do not break in or steal." So Jesus gives us this contrast between earthly treasure versus heavenly treasure. And of course, earthly treasure, we know what that is. That's money, that's possessions, it's all these things here on earth. And Jesus points out that those things, they fade away. They wear down. And even when people say, well, but what about digital? Now money isn't in the form of copper coins, it's in digital currency. Well, inflation's a thing. The $10,000 you saved 20 years ago won't buy you the same amount of stuff as it would back then. And if you have your money in the markets or whatever, things fluctuate, you are just as apt to lose money as to make it oftentimes. So earthly treasures, they fade, they rot, they pass away. But he says to store up heavenly treasures. Now, does that mean that people are going to have a heavenly bank account that they're putting money into? No. That's not what Jesus is saying. But he's pointing out, what are you working for? What are you striving for? Are you striving to serve God, or are you striving to serve yourself? And then he makes this statement, which is really central to everything we're talking about today. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. You see, we invest time and energy in whatever our hearts are devoted to. I need to think about that. We talked about it in our Bible classes a little bit this morning. It's all well and good to say, I'm devoted to God. I want to be a worker for the Lord. But where do we actually spend our time? As I talked about in the Bible class, if you split your day up into a pie chart, and you put blocks of time for everything you do, of course there's the big chunk that's going to be work or school if you're a student, but the other things. Do you spend your time outside of work scheming and dreaming and planning about how to make more money? Or do you spend that time serving God and learning about God and studying about Him? Because we will inevitably invest energy and time into whatever it is that we're devoted to. An analogy in the fun world could be, for me, snowboarding. I love snowboarding. When I was in high school and college, I snowboarded a lot, like every weekend. But even though I still love snowboarding, since Keely and I have gotten married, I've been snowboarding twice in 13 years. I love it, but it's obviously not a priority for me, otherwise I would do it. So we spend our time on the things that are actually important to us. Jesus goes on and he says, the eye is the lamp of the body. So then, if your eye is clear, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light that is in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? He uses this analogy of the eye being the lamp of the body. And to kind of illustrate this, we could think about a car at night. A car's headlights, they point in the direction of travel. Most cars do not have the ability to point their headlights in some other direction than where they're going. So that means that if you're driving at night and you see something interesting off in the woods to the left, to point your headlights at it, you have to point the car off to the woods in the left. And then you're heading towards the woods to the left. See, your focus indicates your direction. Where those lights are pointing are indicating which direction you're already traveling. We would love to think that we can travel towards God, but look over there. No, I'm going this way, but I'm looking over here. Well, that's not the way it works. We may deceive ourselves and think that's what's happening, but where we are focusing is where we are going. Your eye is the lamp of the body, he says. So, Jesus makes this famous statement. No one can serve two masters. For either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. That is a very extreme statement. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. Now we look at this in our human wishy-washiness, our desire to be on the fence, and we say, well, maybe I can not necessarily love or hate either one. Maybe I can lean towards the love on both of them. But let's use the analogy of a small child and their father. How many of us have ever heard or been in a situation where a kid says, my dad never came to any of my sports events or to my recitals or played games with me, and the kid gets the impression, the kid believes that the father doesn't love them. Because the kid doesn't really care how big a paycheck dad is getting. Doesn't care how many hours dad's working. The kid just wants dad's attention, right? When dad spends time with the kid feels loved. Or you think about an elderly person in a nursing home. Their kids may be doing really well financially and doing lots of good things, but that older person in the nursing home just wants someone to come visit them. Just wants someone to come spend time on them. The other person can say, I love you all they want, but if they're not spending time, well, that person feels despised. And that's somewhat what we're looking at here, that you'll love the one and hate the other. You may say you love both masters, but you're devoting time to one and not the other. So the one you're not devoting time to, you're demonstrating that you despise them. You cannot serve God and wealth. So Jesus points out that we really have something of a choice here. That you can spend time on storing up earthly treasures. You can devote your energy to that, or you can spend time storing up heavenly treasures. Those are the choices that Jesus is presenting. But at this point, this brings us to a really important and fundamental question. And that is, does this mean having money is evil? I've talked to people, again, who call themselves Christians, who read what Jesus said there, and the conclusion they come to is that money is evil. People who have money are evil. Therefore, anyone who calls themselves a Christian and has money is evil. Well, is that the case? Well, let's go to 1 Timothy 6. 1 Timothy 6, 9, and 10. And we're going to go back and study more of 1 Timothy 6 later on in the sermon, but I want to look at these two verses right now. Paul writes to Timothy, "But those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a snare, and many foolish and harmful desires which plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil, and some by longing for it have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs." You notice the words that Paul uses. Paul says those who want to get rich and the love of money. He doesn't say those who are rich. He does not say those who have money. He says those who want to get rich and those who love money. What we see from this is that money is not the problem. Money is a thing. Money is a morally neutral item. It's like a brick. A brick can be used to build a house, or a brick can be used to beat somebody over the head and murder them. It's a brick. What matters is how you use it. And the same is true with money. Money can be used to further the gospel, to serve fellow Christians, to take care of the needs of the hungry. Jesus said that when you took care of those who were homeless and in need of food and shelter and clothing, that you did it to him. Well, those things take money. And having money is not the problem. We can't expect for the sinful world to give us money to serve the needs of those who are poor. Having money is not the problem. But loving money is the problem. This also takes the social status out of it. Because it's just as easy for a poor person to love money as a rich person to love money. Someone can love money and be really bad at handling it and end up dirt poor because they love money but they're horrible at handling it, just as much as they could end up being rich and loving money. Okay, but why? Why is loving money the problem? Well, it goes back to what Jesus said. Matthew 6:21. "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." There are plenty of very wealthy Christians who use their money to serve God and to serve others and who are very responsible. It's not the having the money that's the problem. It's where they're storing their treasures, where their heart is. So that brings us then to discussing the evils produced by the love of money. We read that passage that there are all sorts of evil produced by the love of money. Well, what kind of evils are we talking about? And this is not a complete list, but we're going to look at a few evils that the love of money can produce. And we'll start with what we've already read. Matthew 6:24, Jesus says, "No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." So right off the bat, we see that loving money produces divided loyalties. And we see that in action when people say, well, I love God, but I'm not going to come to worship and study His Word because I got to be at work. I love God, but I'm not going to teach anybody the gospel because I got to be at work. I love God, but I'm not going to serve my fellow Christians because it doesn't pay anything. Well, they may make the claim, but their loyalties are divided. But okay, moving now from the spiritual into the very physical, let's go to Luke 3. Luke 3:14. And here, John the Baptizer is speaking to different people about their different needs. And some soldiers were questioning him, saying, "And what about us? What shall we do?" And he said to them, Do not take money from anyone by force, or accuse anyone falsely, and be content with your wages. What practical advice. These soldiers, there would be the temptation to, extort money from people by force. They're the ones with the swords, after all. He says, don't do that. We see from this that loving money can produce violence. I mean, after all, why do people mug each other? It's not because they love each other. It's because they love money more than somebody else, and that produces violence. Why do people rob convenience stores? Well, because they love money. Why do people join the mob or organized crime or become drug dealers? Because they love money. And this can happen on a smaller scale as well. There have been plenty of domestic violence situations that started with money discussions. Loving money can produce violence. Okay. Hopefully most of us aren't violent people. You and I may look at that and say, well, yeah, but I'm not a violent person, so I don't have to worry about that. Well, let's look at another situation. Let's go to Acts 5, 1 through 16. And in Acts 5, 1 through 16, we see Ananias and Sapphira. And to set the stage for this, the church in Jerusalem had just grown by leaps and bounds. There was the day of Pentecost, where there's all these Jews in Jerusalem for that one feast. Peter preaches the first gospel sermon. There's 3,000 converts, and then later on there's 2,000 converts, and there's thousands of people who are now Christians who hadn't been Christians before. And they're hanging out in Jerusalem longer than they planned because they want to learn about Christianity. But they don't have the money for food or shelter or things like that. And so the Christians in Jerusalem and the surrounding area started to sell their possessions, their homes, their land, and give the money to the apostles so that these people could be fed. Then enter Ananias and Sapphira, and they wanted to gain some of the glory that they saw when people were giving these gifts. So they sold a plot of land, but they were also greedy. And so they kept some for themselves, but they told the apostles, here's the whole amount. And God did not respond well to that. Peter tells them, when you had that money in your possession, it was yours to do with as you wished. They could have kept it. They could have said, we kept half of it and we gave half of it. But they lied. They tried to deceive the Holy Spirit, and God struck them down for that. We see from this that loving money produces dishonesty. And we see that in action, don't we? People who, they're so obsessed with money that they'll do dishonest things. In fact, Keely and I were watching some videos about supposedly lucrative side hustles the other day. A side hustle, if you're not familiar with that phrase, is a basically side job, a thing you do on the side of your main job to try to make money. some people have some very lucrative, quote-unquote, side hustles. But we were watching a video, and the guy was describing how to clone Amazon listings, increase the price, and set up a system on your computer where it would order from the person you cloned from, and they send it, but you get extra revenue. It's dishonest. It's dishonest scales, as it were, because you're cheating people out of extra money, trying to get something for nothing. Another one where they were describing how to pirate other people's content and post it on YouTube with ads so that someone else makes the content and you just get the ad revenue. It's dishonesty. It's lying. But people go into dishonesty to try and make money. The love of money can produce dishonesty. Okay, well, we're familiar with that. But is it really a big deal? Let's go to 1 Corinthians 5. 1 Corinthians 5:11. And in this section, Paul is talking to the Corinthians about immorality in the church. And he says, "But actually I wrote to you not to associate with any so-called brother if he's an immoral person or covetous or an idolater or a reviler or a drunkard or a swindler, not even to eat with such a one." So he talks about here a swindler, which is someone who cheats others out of money, using dishonesty. That's what we were just talking about. But you notice what he says here. He says, "I wrote to you not to associate with a so-called brother who does these things, not even to eat with such a one." So loving money can produce or can sever fellowship. That puts it back into the spiritual realm, doesn't it? That loving money can sever our fellowship with our Christian family. And I've been on a distance and seen this sort of thing happen. I've heard from people about these situations happening where someone in the church hires a fellow Christian to do a job, maybe as a contractor or as an employee or whatever, and that person they hired who claimed to be a Christian ends up cheating or stealing or doing something dishonest. And it causes problems in the church because of that person's dishonest love of money. That loving of money can sever fellowship. But why? Why does it sever fellowship? Well, let's go to Colossians 3. Colossians 3, verse 5. It says, "Therefore consider the members of your earthly body as dead to immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and greed, which amounts to idolatry." Notice what he says there about greed. Greed, which amounts to idolatry. So, the love of money is idolatry. Loving money severs fellowship because loving money is making money your God. And that goes right back to what Jesus said about you can't serve two masters. Why not? Well, because loving money makes money your God. And you sacrifice your time and your relationship with your family and maybe your health and your relationship with God on that altar of money. And how many times do people say things like, well, when I've reached my savings goals, I'll be able to devote more time to the church. When I get this promotion, I'll be able to spend more time with the church. When I'm retired, I'll be able to spend more time with the church. Because they're putting money as being more important than serving God. Now, it might seem like that's like the pinnacle of about as bad as you can get. But there's another problem that can get even further. 2 Peter 2. 2 Peter 2 talks about false teachers. And in 2 Peter 2, verses 14 and 15, we learn this. "Having eyes full of adultery that never cease from sin, enticing unstable souls, having a heart trained in greed, accursed children." So false teachers have hearts trained in greed. Forsaking the right way, they have gone astray, having followed the way of Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved the wages of unrighteousness. So these false teachers are driven by greed. We see that loving money can produce apostasy and false teaching. So not only are they themselves leaving God, but they're teaching others to leave God. And this sadly happens. We all hear the stories about televangelists who say things like, God wants to bless you, just send me $100. There's no verse that says that. They're using assumed righteousness to get rich. But even bring it down a notch. There's a temptation for people like authors or preachers. Because, well, to be honest, the Lord's church is a small customer base. You know, if you're an author and you're trying to sell books and make some money, the Lord's church is a very small audience. So they loosen their doctrine. They try to pander to a wider demographic. They end up teaching false doctrine to sell books to make money. See, the love of money can produce apostasy and false teaching. And that's one of the many reasons why there are so many churches in the world. It's because someone along the line got greedy. And they said, you know, if I change this bit, I could get more people. Or I could get more money. And we could talk about that all day long because church history is full of that sort of thing. So what's the answer? We see the problems, but what's the answer? Well, the solution is contentment. Let's go back to 1 Timothy 6. 1 Timothy 6, 3 through 12. I told you we were going to see the context of this from earlier. 1 Timothy 6, 3 through 12. And starting in verse 3, we read, If anyone advocates a different doctrine and does not agree with sound words, those of our Lord Jesus Christ, and with the doctrines conforming to godliness, he is conceited and understands nothing, but he has a morbid interest in controversial questions and disputes about words, out of which arise envy, strife, abusive language, evil suspicions, and constant friction between men of depraved mind and depraved of the truth, who suppose that godliness is a means of gain. Paul here basically describes the same thing that Peter described about how false teachers are driven by greed. And then notice what he says. But godliness actually is a means of great gain when accompanied by contentment. Okay, so godliness actually is a means of great gain. He's not saying that you're going to get rich by being godly. He's talking about a different type of gain here. When accompanied by contentment. Okay, so why? Why is godliness a path to great gain when accompanied by contentment? Well, he says, for we have brought nothing into this world, so we also cannot take anything out of it either. I memorized that in a different translation. I realized I put it also, there's no also. So we cannot take anything out of it either. Dan likes to say, you never see a hearse pulling a U-Haul. You can't take any of the stuff you get in this life. All those pharaohs from ancient Egypt who were buried with loads and loads of gold, it didn't do them any good. It just got stolen and is now in some history museum someplace. This is why Jesus said to store up treasures in heaven. Because earthly treasure, well, it doesn't do us any good in the long run. Store up treasure in heaven, because where your heart is, or where your treasure is, there your heart will also be. So Paul goes on, he says, if we have food and covering, with these we shall be content. Now, by American standards, that sounds really, really basic. Food and covering. Your absolute basic necessities, with these we shall be content. Now, Paul, of course, was a great example of that. Paul could have had power and position and wealth. He could have stayed in Jerusalem, become one of the Sanhedrin, and become a famous, powerful person. But instead, he decided to serve God by traveling around, being beaten and whipped and hungry and homeless, to teach the gospel. And people look at this today and they think, surely I could not be content with just food and covering. You know, after all, I need to have my Netflix and Hulu and Amazon Prime memberships. I need to be able to have a nice car to drive around. So, why is contentment so important? Why is contentment this ideal that's set forth? Now let's go to Hebrews 13. Because the Hebrew writer tells us. Hebrews 13, 5 and 6 says, make sure that your character is free from the love of money, being content with what you have. Okay, so he basically just summed up what was said in the previous passage. Make sure that your character is free from the love of money, because being content with what you have. Then notice what he says. For he himself has said, I will never desert you, nor will I forsake you. Who said that? Well, God. God says that. God said, I will never desert you, nor will I forsake you. So that we confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What will man do to me? This honestly is really convicting. Because very often we say, money is my helper, and I will not be afraid. But here he says, the Lord is my helper. That's why the writer can say, let your character be free from the love of money, being content with what you have. Because he's asking the question, really, where do you place your faith? What is your faith in? Is your faith in God, or is it in money? Think about that. Like, just myself. When I come on a problem, do I go to God for the solution? Or do I think, how can I make some more money to solve this problem? To be honest, my answer isn't always the right one. That's a really hard question. Where does our faith actually lie? Do we trust God enough to apply His Word? Now, as a caveat to this, some people have looked at this and said, okay, I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to sit back, live in my mom's basement, not get a job, and God's just going to shower blessings on me. No. Because part of the whole faith in God thing is God says, he who shall not work shall not eat. God says to go labor with your hands and do good. So this is not saying, don't put any effort forth, lay back, don't do anything, and God will just take care of you. If we trust in God, then we will do what God said. But that really is what we're talking about here. Do we trust God enough to do what He says? Or do we think money's the answer, and we put our faith and our trust in money, and say, well, God will just have to wait His turn? So, today, as we've been discussing this question, are you a double agent for money? We really could talk about money for weeks on end. The Bible has a lot to say about money and the Christian. But today we've looked at the fact that you cannot serve two masters. We've seen some evils that can come about by the love of money. And we've discussed the solution, which is contentment. So the question really comes tonight, or the application should be, let's put our faith in God rather than money. You and I, as Christians in the Tilton, Northfield, Franklin, Plymouth area, let's put our faith in God. Let's do the best we can day in and day out, but trusting Him. And use money as a tool to, pay your bills and all that jazz, but put your faith in God. Now, today, if you're with us and you're a Christian and you realize that you've been putting your faith in money and not in God, we want to be here for you. We want to encourage you, not shame you or put you down, but encourage you. We want to pray with you. Or if you have some other problem going on in your life, we want to be here as a support network. So if you have a need, when we have our invitation song, I encourage you to come up to the front row. One of our elders will come speak with you. And if you're not yet a Christian, but you realize that you need to change the direction of your life to serve God, we want to help you with that. We want to teach you what the Bible says about being a Christian. And If you're ready, we would love to baptize you. So if you have a need, whatever your need may be, please let it be known as Bob leads us in this invitation song.
I know